How's it going, fellow pickers? If you're anything like me, I'm sure that at some point in your musical journey, you found yourself at a standstill with your improv. You know your scales, you know your arpeggios, you know a bunch of licks, but those licks are sounding pretty stale over the course of a 3-hour gig or jam session. So what do? You start trying to make stuff up on the spot, but it all kind of sounds the same, or it sounds like you're practicing scales or working through some exercise. So what's the solution? The solution is to start bringing in notes that are outside of the scale. And I think this is very frightening for a lot of musicians, and it doesn't need to be. So what we're going to do in this video is take a look at how we can start borrowing notes that are outside of the scale and bring in some chromaticism into our playing. We're going to look at 2 examples, small segments from Bela, Fleck's Baptist Pumpkin Farm and the tune Paddy on the Turnpike. We're going to take some of the ideas in those 2 tunes and put them into Soldier's Joy and start looking at how we can build these ideas into our own solos. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll feel a lot more comfortable borrowing from outside chords. Let's take a look at the tunes. Let's take a closer look at those 2 examples that we just looked at. But before we do that, I should mention that the tab and sheet music to the full tunes that I'm playing in this video will be available on my Patreon page, which I will put here. And if you're interested in learning Paddy on the Turnpike, I did recently do a video of that, and I will link that to this video. There's a couple things that we need to make sure that we understand fully. So we need to know the difference between chromatic and diatonic, because I'm going to be using those terms a lot in this video. Diatonic basically is just your standard scale. So in the case of the 2 examples we just looked at, those are both in the key of G. So we'd be looking at just a normal G scale. And if you don't know that, we'll run through it really quick. So that's G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. And then into our next octave, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. On the flip side, chromatic essentially just means every possible note. So a chromatic scale would look like this. Right, where we're just kind of playing everything. So for the sake of this video, we're usually going to be referring to chromatic as something that isn't fitting into the diatonic scale. Typically, it's going to be referencing a note that is 1 fret higher or 1 fret lower than a target note that we are working toward. Let's take a look at the chromatic movement that's happening in Bela Fleck's Baptist Pumpkin Farm. The section that we want to be looking at is the very first section of the B part of the tune. And what he's doing is he's really just working up the scale from E to B, but he's including lower chromatic neighbor tones and upper diatonic neighbor tones. But he's doing it kind of in an unexpected way. So he's starting on E, and then he's going to go down to the lower chromatic neighbor, which is just going to be 1 fret, and then back up to E. Then to lead into the next note of the scale, the F sharp, he's going to overshoot it by going to its diatonic upper neighbor tone. So in this case, that's G. And remember, diatonic just means the next note of the scale. And so from there, he goes down to the F sharp and then does another chromatic movement. So the next note that we would be going to in the scale is G, but he's going to continue the same pattern. He's going to go up to the next diatonic note and then down to the G, and then lower chromatic back up to the G. And then, again, the next note of the scale would be A, but he's going to overshoot it by going to the next diatonic, which is B. And then the lower chromatic again. And then the same thing. He ends by getting to that B by going to the upper diatonic of B, which is C. So the part that we're really going to focus on is that diatonic step down and back up. For Paddy on the Turnpike, the section that we want to actually focus on is the second phrase of the A section. So in that section, we're actually working over an F chord because Paddy on the Turnpike is a Mixolydian tune, meaning that it uses the flat 7th scale degree quite a bit. Our melody is starting on the D. This is kind of an interesting choice because it's not really a chord tone, but it is the relative minor, or you could think of it as the 6th of F. So it's sort of like a cousin chord tone. But starting on that D, they're actually starting that movement the same way that Bela Fleck does his, right? So that step down, back up into their D. So using that lower chromatic neighbor, getting back into the D. And then walking up, so playing E and F, back down, E, D, F, E, D. And this is the part of the tune that we really want to look at and pay attention to. They're doing a double neighbor tone movement. So instead of just one neighbor tone leading into their target note, they cycle around it. So they're playing one note lower, a diatonic step higher, and then finally resolving down to the D. And that's something we're going to be using quite a bit later on. So before we take a look at how we might put some of these ideas into a tune like Soldier's Joy, let's talk about how we can just expand them in general. One of the easiest and most obvious things is this idea is a really common and very easy to use one. So if I'm working through an arpeggio, so for example in the key of G, would be G, B, D, G, I can just interrupt that arpeggio with a lower chromatic neighbor. I can also use these to expand it. So if I have a dominant G sound that would have the F natural or a G7 chord, I can include those as well. So as the chord gets expanded, I can continue these chromatic ideas. Now the other really fun thing is the idea that we can have two chromatic notes leading into one note. Right, so I have a lower chromatic neighbor tone that we're seeing have used in both of the tunes, but I do also have an upper chromatic neighbor tone that I can use as well. The upper chromatic neighbor can be a little bit more spicy, so you might want to use it a little bit more sparingly. And then I can also pair those with neighbor tones that are not chromatic, so the diatonic neighbor tones. So in the case of that G arpeggio, maybe I want to start a lower chromatic down, and then a diatonic up. And you'll notice that when we're talking about like the B or the third note of an arpeggio, that the lower chromatic going to the upper diatonic is going to be the same as the upper chromatic. When I get to D though, it won't be, and it won't be when I'm playing G, right? And you can pair these. You can reverse them, so you can have an upper diatonic going into a lower chromatic, or you can try flipping them. You could have a lower diatonic into an upper chromatic. Any kind of combination of these can work really, really well to get you some of those outside sounds. Really, the best thing that you can do is find a bunch of tunes and experiment with them. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is that with Bela Fleck's Pumpkin Farm, Baptist Pumpkin Farm, is that they don't necessarily have to be only chord tones, because he's walking up the scale. Right? So anything that is part of the melody for bluegrass music, you can see if you can put a chromatic neighbor tone around it to lead into it or to lead out of it. Now, traditional wisdom will tell you that a chord tone will have the best resolution. So if you want to break the tension immediately, you probably want to stick with a chord tone. But there are plenty of other options. The big takeaway before we even get started with Soldier's Joy is that you have one note higher or one note lower, or one fret higher or one fret lower, and you can just kind of play through those as long as they're leading into the target note. So if they know where they're going, they will resolve just fine and sound good. You can also pair these with notes from the scale. So you can have a chromatic note going into a diatonic note before it resolves to the target note. The biggest thing out of all of this is making sure that when you use a chromatic movement in this way or a neighbor tone in this way, that you are resolving it to your target. So let's take a look at how we might incorporate some of these ideas into a common tune like Soldier's Joy. Let's take a look at some of the ideas that I was putting into the B section of Soldier's Joy. So the first thing we need to do is get aware of what our scale is. We're working in the key of D, so we have an F sharp and a C sharp. And like before, like any other scale we do, we want to start on the lowest possible note we have, which in this case is G, and then walk up the scale from there so that we make sure we cover any note that might come up. So we have G, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G, A, and if you want to finish it out, B, C sharp, D. So the next step was to break the melody down and get it as simple as I could so that I could start adding, so I could have the room to add in a lot of these chromatic ideas. So that made it sound like this. From there, I just kind of started tossing in the different ideas that we were seeing. So the first one I did was the bela fleck borrowed lower chromatic, where I'm going down and coming back up to the original note. So I put that over the first two measures, and I came out with this. It's worth noting at this point that if you have an open string and you need to go to a lower chromatic, it'll be on the 6th fret of the string above it. So if I'm playing an open E, I need to get a lower chromatic neighbor, it would be the 6th fret of A. After that, I just did a lower chromatic into each of the notes that we were playing. So that's our second phrase, and I'm just putting lower chromatics before each note. And here, I want to resolve to the D to kind of release some of the tension. So I'm just doing the lower chromatic, upper diatonic into D. And it is true that really that C sharp that I'm calling the lower chromatic is also a diatonic note, but for the purposes of this, it's kind of easier to just think of it as chromatic. From there, I wanted to start working through some upper chromatic ideas and get an idea how that sounded. What I'm doing there, walking from the D that we resolved to down to the lower chromatic, but then for the next part of that phrase, the next two notes are going to have an upper chromatic note into a lower chromatic, just to kind of break that tension again. So the following phrase is this again, which I'm really just doing pretty much the same thing as before. Then we have our final phrase of the tune, and I'm just putting lower chromatics before each of those. And then sort of ending it out. The second portion of the B section is a little more exciting than the first because we start using the double chromatic idea that we saw happen in Paddy on the Turnpike. So instead of having, we end up with, and the way that this is working is that instead of going to my D for that idea, I'm starting one note below, a diatonic note above, into the D. Play the F sharp, and then do the same thing that I was doing for the D when I get to the A. So chromatic below, diatonic above, into A. But for the next section, I'm going to stick to chromatic notes to surround it. So instead of going to E, I'm going to do chromatic below, chromatic above, E. And then instead of going to G, I do chromatic above, chromatic below, G. So that, and then just fill it out with E and C sharp. The next phrase, which would normally be, we're doing the bela fleck idea. Chromatic walk into the F sharp, chromatic walk down to the A, and then we are kind of borrowing that idea from Paddy on the Turnpike where we use the relative minor as a chord tone, or the sixth as a chord tone, the extension. So normally this would be A, we're getting that F sharp, so we're walking chromatically up to the F sharp, chromatically down to the E, and then just a little bit of filler there. This last little bit is probably my favorite. We would normally be playing to finish it out, but we end up with and what we're doing here is we're starting with that bela fleck idea and then doing the double neighbor tone idea to get into the A. So instead of having, that's what we end up with. So bela fleck, and then aiming for the A, we have the diatonic up, chromatic below, into the A, and then chromatic below the F sharp into the F sharp to end out that measure. And then for this next bit, which would normally be, we end up with, and so what we're doing here, same thing, bela fleck idea, and then we're aiming at the G, so we're going to be a diatonic above the G, chromatic below the G, and then resolve to the G. And the next two notes to finish this out are leading into the F sharp of the next measure. So we're doing chromatic below, chromatic above, and then into that F sharp. And really from there, it's just filler to end it out and resolve it nicely.